happens when the line between freedom and control blurs under flashing sirens and tear gas. The morning sky over Chicago is pale gray, but the air trembles with anger. Hundreds of voices rise outside the Broadview ICE Detention Center, chants turning to screams as riot shields close in. Cameras roll, batons strike. A young woman falls, blood streaking down her face. The crowd shouts the question that will echo across the nation: who do you protect? This was supposed to be another protest. Instead, it became a confrontation that symbolized a country at war with itself. Under President Donald Trump's second term, immigration enforcement has transformed into a show of strength, what officials now call Operation Midway Blitz. Behind the policy lies a message: America will reclaim its borders no matter the cost. But what began as an immigration operation now looks like a test of constitutional limits. Reports from Reuters and The Guardian confirmed that at least 15 people were arrested that morning, most charged with obstruction or resisting arrest. Yet civil rights lawyers argue that the real damage was not physical, it was institutional. Broadview isn't just a local story, one expert told BBC News. It's a mirror of how power is being exercised nationwide. Federal agents arrived before dawn. State police formed lines before the protesters even began gathering. Drones hovered above, capturing real-time footage fed to Homeland Security's central hub in Washington. The tactics resembled military operations more than crowd control. Jane's Defense Weekly later noted the use of tactical coordination software normally reserved for anti-terror operations being applied against U.S. civilians. The symbolism was unmistakable. Trump's America, faced with border crises and renewed cartel threats, projected power inward. The same technologies once used against foreign adversaries were now policing American streets. DW analysts compared it to a form of hybrid domestic warfare where information intimidation and law enforcement merge into one apparatus. The global parallels are haunting. In Ukraine, Russian forces justify harsh crackdowns as counterterrorism. In Iran, dissenters face surveillance drones. In China, social stability overrides civil liberties. And now in the United States, the world's beacon of democracy, armored officers march against unarmed citizens. The difference, as Al Jazeera observed, is not in the method, but in the justification. For the people on the ground, ideology meant little. A mother screamed for her son as officers dragged him away. A teacher held a cardboard sign that read, "Freedom is not a threat." By dusk, the pavement bore the marks of rubber bullets and blood. The streets went quiet, but something irreversible had been set in motion. The Broadview clash wasn't just about immigration, it was about identity, about what kind of power the US government is willing to wield in the name of security, and what the American people are willing to accept in return. As night fell over Chicago, the question lingered in the haze. If America polices its conscience like it polices its borders, what remains of its freedom? The images from Chicago rippled through Washington like a shockwave. Within hours, federal spokespeople labeled the Broadview incident an act of provoked resistance, the latest target of Operation Midway Blitz. But what exactly is this operation? Behind its official language lies a complex web of federal coordination, one that fuses border enforcement, counter-terror tactics, and political theater into a single strategy of control. Reuters describes Midway Blitz as a synchronized security initiative involving ICE DHS and state tactical units launched under direct presidential authority. Leaked documents reviewed by The Guardian suggest its mandate extends far beyond immigration. It includes urban stabilization and federal reinforcement of local law. Critics interpret that as a euphemism for martial oversight. The operation's true purpose, experts argue, is psychological, to project an image of unbreakable order amid the growing unrest across America's major cities. Under President Donald Trump's directive, the campaign intensified in early 2025 after a wave of anti-deportation protests spread across the Midwest. Cities like St. Louis, Detroit, and Minneapolis saw similar deployments of armored personnel carriers and federal tactical units. The administration defended the show of force as necessary deterrence, but DW's Berlin bureau questioned whether it was also political a display of dominance before a skeptical electorate and a fractured Congress. Al Jazeera's coverage added an international lens the US, it argued, was exporting its doctrine of preemptive control inward, using the same logic once applied in Iraq and Afghanistan to justify the surveillance of its own population. Defense News reported that elements of Operation Midway Blitz drew tactical insight from urban pacification models developed for counterinsurgency operations, suggesting a military mindset, not a civilian one. The deeper implication runs beyond law enforcement. Midway Blitz demonstrates how federal institutions under pressure to maintain security increasingly rely on integrated AI-based data systems, predictive analytics, drone surveillance, facial recognition, the same networked architecture the Pentagon calls Homeland Sentinel. Jane's Defense Weekly noted its uncanny similarity to the command and control grids deployed by US forces in Eastern Europe to monitor Russian troop movements. In Ukraine, technology predicts battlefield risk. In Chicago, it predicts who might protest next. The line between foreign adversary and domestic dissenter grows dangerously thin. Analysts warn this evolution mirrors global trends: Israel's use of algorithmic surveillance in Gaza, China's stability maintenance systems in Xinjiang, Russia's biometric checkpoints in occupied territories all seek to manage dissent before it materializes. Now the world's leading democracy appears to be adopting the same playbook. But the American context adds a moral paradox. The White House insists the goal is national unity, yet its methods deepen division. Local police chiefs resent federal intrusion. Governors decry overreach. Illinois' governor publicly accused Washington of commandeering state resources to silence its own citizens. The statement carried by BBC and Reuters ignited a week-long standoff over jurisdiction. For ordinary citizens, the message feels unmistakable: speak out and risk being labeled a threat. The climate of fear grows thicker with each new operation. Still, the government presses forward, citing unprecedented border threats and foreign infiltration. Security briefings link immigrant networks to cartel funding to terrorism, and terrorism to national collapse, an escalating chain of logic that turns protest into potential insurgency. And yet, beneath the noise, one essential question remains unanswered. When every street becomes a security zone, can any city still claim to be free? The aftermath of the Broadview clash quickly moved from the streets into America's courtrooms. Within 48 hours, a coalition of civil rights organizations led by the ACLU and supported by Illinois' Attorney General filed for an emergency injunction against the Department of Homeland Security. Their argument: federal agents had exercised powers that exceeded constitutional authority. The case became a flashpoint broadcast on every major network. CNN called it the first real legal stress test of Trump's second-term immigration doctrine. The president's response came swiftly. Standing at a White House podium flanked by ICE and DHS officials, he declared, "Law and order are not negotiable. If mayors and governors won't defend their cities, the federal government will." His statement drew thunderous applause from supporters and outrage from critics who saw it as a direct challenge to state sovereignty. Reuters reported that in private, several Justice Department officials expressed concern about the expanding use of federal forces in domestic policing. One senior official speaking anonymously described the situation as a constitutional experiment playing out in real time. The phrase spread like wildfire across social media. Legal scholars interviewed by The Guardian pointed out that while federal law permits intervention in certain emergencies, the scale and duration of Operation Midway Blitz blurred those limits. When a temporary deployment turns into a standing force, one analyst warned the distinction between law enforcement and occupation disappears. At the same time, the judiciary was awakening. A federal judge in Illinois ordered all ICE agents operating within the state to wear active body cameras during future raids, a direct attempt to impose transparency on a system that had functioned in shadows. But according to BBC News, compliance was sporadic at best. In one case, footage mysteriously vanished after a violent altercation. Across America, a constitutional tug-of-war intensified. Governors in California, New York, and Washington joined Illinois in demanding limits to federal deployment. Trump countered by invoking the Executive Security Restoration Act, granting the White House expanded authority over national stabilization zones. DW reported that European observers saw it as a potential tipping point, a redefinition of federalism through force. Behind the legal language lies a broader philosophical struggle: security versus freedom. Each ruling, each televised statement became a test of what Americans were willing to sacrifice for safety. Al Jazeera drew chilling parallels to global precedents: Israel's use of security exemptions to justify indefinite detentions, China's public safety laws to silence dissent, Russia's criminalization of protests under the banner of stability. And yet, America's situation is more complex. Here, the battle is not only against perceived threats, but also against itself, against the fear that democracy has grown too fragile to defend its own values without breaking them. The legal front line stretched from the Supreme Court chambers to small town council meetings. In Chicago, Mayor Katrina Thompson became an unlikely national figure after condemning federal tactics as a betrayal of the Constitution. Her remarks covered by Reuters turned her into both hero and target. Overnight, her social media flooded with threats. In an editorial, Defense News argued that the White House's militarized posture carried strategic consequences beyond domestic optics. Allies abroad, it said, view the crackdown as a sign of political instability within the U.S. NATO diplomats. Speaking to DW, described growing unease about America's ability to balance global leadership with internal unrest. If Washington polices its own streets like occupied territory, one envoy noted, how can it still lecture others about democracy? The stakes extend far beyond Illinois. In an era of global surveillance and disinformation, every baton swing, every arrest broadcast live becomes part of the world's judgment on American credibility. The legal war has only just begun. The question haunting both sides now cuts to the core of the republic. Can a nation preserve law and liberty at once, or must one inevitably destroy the other? By the following week, Broadview had become more than a local story. It was a symbol replayed across a dozen American cities. From Los Angeles to Portland, from Houston to New York, the same choreography unfolded: federal agents in tactical gear drones circling above tear gas blooming under gray skies. Reuters called it a wave of synchronized enforcement unseen since the civil rights era. In Portland, protesters chanted "No kings, no cages" as DHS units cleared downtown streets. In Atlanta, students locked arms outside a courthouse until officers dragged them away. The BBC described the scenes as eerily consistent, suggesting centralized command coordination. Anonymous officials later confirmed that data from Operation Midway Blitz was being fed into a national database Sentinel grid, allowing Washington to predict where protests might erupt next. What began as an immigration crackdown had become a real-time experiment in predictive policing. Jane's Defense Weekly reported that several of the command protocols mirrored NATO's crisis response architecture, built to track insurgencies abroad, not civic demonstrations at home. DW analysts in Berlin called it the militarization of dissent management. The echoes reached far beyond US borders. In Ukraine, the ongoing conflict with Russia had transformed entire cities into surveillance networks where AI tracked troop movements and flagged anomalous behavior. In Iran, protests over the Tehran fuel crisis were met with drone-based crowd suppression. In China, public gatherings were scanned for instigators using social credit algorithms. Now, America seemed to be joining the same technological league, but with the moral weight of democracy hanging in the balance. Defense News observed that Washington's internal militarization was bleeding into foreign policy perception. Allies watched nervously as US cities resembled controlled zones, while adversaries capitalized on the chaos. Russian media mocked the US for lecturing others on freedom while tear-gassing its own. Chinese outlets called it the end of American moral authority. And yet, inside the White House, the atmosphere was triumphalist. Trump's senior advisors framed Operation Midway Blitz as proof that America will not kneel to chaos. Internal memos leaked to The Guardian described the effort as a successful stabilization doctrine with global implications. The language hinted at something deeper. The administration saw domestic enforcement as a demonstration of resilience to both foreign rivals and domestic critics. But there was another cost less visible, yet far more corrosive. Communities across the Midwest fractured under suspicion. Police officers reported exhaustion, some resigning after being ordered to confront citizens they once served. Families split along ideological lines. One former ICE officer interviewed by Al Jazeera confessed, "I thought I was defending America, but now I don't know who America is anymore." The human toll extended beyond politics. Hospitals reported surges of respiratory injuries linked to riot control chemicals. Legal clinics overflowed with asylum seekers and detained protesters. Churches opened their doors at night to shelter those afraid of arrest. The scenes resembled crisis zones, only this time the battlefield was domestic. Strategically, Washington's iron-fisted stance may have restored short-term order, but globally it exposed America's internal fragility. DW pointed out that Russia and China were already citing US unrest to justify their own crackdowns. The moral mirror had turned. By October's end, the phrase "the Broadview Doctrine" began circulating in foreign policy circles, shorthand for domestic projection of power to sustain political legitimacy. NATO diplomats privately debated whether the US could still serve as leader of the free world while deploying troops against its own citizens. And so, across oceans and time zones, a haunting question emerged, the same one shouted by protesters in Chicago, now whispered in foreign capitals. If the world's strongest democracy begins to fear its own people, who will the rest of the world look to for freedom? By the time night fell on Broadview's burned asphalt, the battle had shifted from the streets to the screens. What began as a protest had become a digital war zone, every frame, every scream, every baton swing dissected in real time by millions. Reuters reported that within 2 hours, over 47 million people had viewed live streams from the scene. Hashtags like Lark Broadview Clash, like Operation Midway, and our Free Speech Zone trended across platforms. America's divide wasn't just physical anymore, it was algorithmic. The Guardian noted that media outlets quickly split into parallel narratives. Conservative networks framed the event as a heroic stand against anarchy, while progressive channels described it as state-sponsored brutality. BBC analysts called it a collision between truth and loyalty. Each side spoke to its own audience, its own reality, and facts became weapons in an information war. Al Jazeera's coverage carried a striking observation. The battle for American democracy now unfolds not in Congress or the courts, but in the comments section. Digital echo chambers amplified anger and mistrust, turning every citizen into both witness and soldier in an invisible propaganda front. The US government's communication office, flooded with disinformation reports, struggled to maintain coherence. Foreign trolls traced back to Russian and Chinese networks magnified false footage and deepfakes of ICE officers executing civilians, feeding chaos into an already fractured narrative. Defense News later revealed that Operation Midway Blitz included an internal media response component known as Echo Shield, a rapid rebuttal network designed to flood online platforms with official statements and counter-narratives. The goal was to control perception as much as the protests themselves. Yet, according to a DW investigation, this effort backfired by oversaturating social media with conflicting claims the government fueled suspicion rather than trust. The crisis evolved into a psychological battlefield. Videos of crying children and injured medics went viral, triggering global outrage. European newspapers compared the images to Cold War propaganda reels. NATO diplomats privately warned that the moral authority of the United States is eroding at digital speed. Experts say the parallels with global conflict zones are chilling. In Ukraine, drone footage and propaganda videos became decisive tools of warfare. In Gaza, both sides weaponized social media to control global opinion. In China, censorship operates as a silent algorithmic firewall. Now America, long the champion of open discourse, found itself playing the same game it once condemned. Inside the US, the human cost of this information war was staggering. Families split along ideological lines. Journalists received death threats. A DW correspondent covering the Chicago protests was hospitalized after being struck by a rubber bullet. The attack captured on live broadcast became a symbol of the shrinking space for truth itself. Amid the chaos, the White House insisted on its narrative. "We are restoring peace, not silencing dissent," said one spokesperson. Yet the images told a different story, lines of armored officers facing citizens holding candles and flags. The silence between their chants seemed to carry more weight than words. Al Jazeera asked a haunting question. If a government must drown its own people's voices in noise to maintain control, what does that say about the strength of its democracy? By week's end, international reactions poured in. The European Union issued a statement urging restraint and respect for fundamental rights. The United Nations requested an independent review of police conduct in Illinois. Beijing, meanwhile, released a mocking statement claiming the US had lost the moral compass it used to sell to the world. As misinformation hardened into ideology, America faced a deeper truth power in the digital age isn't held by who controls the streets, but who controls the story. And yet, even that power comes with a cost, because when truth becomes partisan and every camera becomes a weapon, who will the world believe when the next crisis arrives? By dawn, Broadview was silent again. The smoke had cleared, the chants had faded, and the streets lay scarred by rubber bullets, footprints, and fragments of protest signs trampled into the asphalt. But the silence wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. America, after one night of fury, was left staring into its own reflection. Reuters described the morning as eerily calm, like the pause after a storm that hasn't yet decided whether to return. Residents swept glass from storefronts. Journalists recorded the emptiness. The ICE facility still loomed behind barbed wire, its floodlights flickering through the mist, an image both mundane and menacing. Mayor Katrina Thompson, once a quiet local leader, now found herself at the center of a national reckoning. In a statement carried by BBC News, she said, "We told them to stay peaceful, but peace isn't what they wanted." Whether she meant the protesters or the federal agents was unclear, perhaps both. Across the country, the fallout deepened. Dozens of lawsuits were filed alleging excessive force, unlawful detention, and media suppression. The ACLU called Broadview a constitutional red line. Meanwhile, White House officials doubled down, citing national security and foreign infiltration as justification. The rhetoric grew sharper, the tone more defiant. DW's analysis warned that the longer this confrontation continues, the more America begins to resemble the adversaries it once denounced. In Israel and Iran, authorities justified crackdowns as existential defense. In China, order outweighed liberty. In Russia, protests were declared threats to national survival. Now the same language echoed through Washington. But beneath the politics, the human toll endured. Families of the arrested waited outside detention centers for news. One mother, quoted by The Guardian, held her daughter's scarf and whispered she wanted to speak. They made her disappear. The emotional fractures ran deeper than party lines or ideology. At the Pentagon, strategists quietly debated how domestic unrest might erode America's international credibility. Defense News reported that allies within NATO had expressed concern over America's internal cohesion and whether its institutions could still function under stress. A nation that doubts itself cannot lead the world, said one European defense minister anonymously. The geopolitical impact was immediate. Moscow amplified the images through state media, calling the US a democracy in decline. Beijing released editorials describing Washington's hypocrisy on human rights. In Tehran, state television aired the clashes on repeat, declaring even their people no longer trust their government. But perhaps the most painful wounds were psychological. In living rooms across the Midwest, Americans watched footage of officers confronting citizens and asked the question no one wanted to answer. When did we start fearing each other more than our enemies? Al Jazeera's commentary put it bluntly. The crisis at Broadview was not just a political confrontation, it was a spiritual one. The United States must decide whether it is a nation of control or a nation of conscience. By the week's end, the official report listed 15 arrests, several injuries, and no fatalities. But statistics could not capture what had been lost: a sense of trust, of unity, of shared belief in the rule of law. The White House called it a success. The people called it something else. And as the sun rose again over Chicago's skyline, its light glinted off the silent gates of the detention center, cold steel, reflecting a question that refused to fade. If the world's last superpower cannot protect both its borders and its ideals, then what exactly is it still defending? The Broadview clash became a defining moment of 2025, a collision between power and principle, order and liberty. What began as a protest against immigration enforcement escalated into a nationwide test of democracy under President Donald Trump's Operation Midway Blitz. Across 6 sections, this story traced the arc from confrontation to crisis, a militarized response, legal battles, challenging executive overreach, a digital war for truth, and a growing fracture between government authority and public conscience. Reuters, BBC, DW, and other global outlets documented how domestic enforcement mirrored foreign warfare, predictive surveillance, AI coordination, and information dominance once reserved for external enemies. International observers compared America's crackdown to the authoritarian playbooks of Russia, China, and Iran. Yet beneath the geopolitics lies a human story: citizens who spoke, officers who obeyed, families who feared, and a nation that questioned itself. The world watched. The question remains, can the United States defend its democracy without dismantling what makes it worth defending?